All rise for the court. This is the story of the O.J. Simpson trial, also known as the trial of the century. It was a criminal trial that took place in 1995 in which professional American football player and actor Orenthal James Simpson, aka O.J., was tried for the murders of his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend, Ronald Goldman. The evidence against him was strong, including DNA evidence. But it was his defense team, led by Johnnie Cochran, that turned the tide. One of the most famous closing arguments in legal history ensued, changing the course of the trial. Here's how it all went down. The year was 1994, and Nicole Brown Simpson had been brutally murdered along with her male friend. They were found outside her condo after having dinner at a restaurant in Brentwood, Los Angeles. She had been stabbed multiple times. On the side of her neck was a pair of earrings that flew off as she struggled to free herself from the assailant. From a distance, the earrings could not be seen, but forensic teams would later find them, and they would tie O.J. to the scene of the crime because, well, they were his wife's. But there was another piece of physical evidence collected from the crime scene, something that seemed to completely tie O.J. to the crime. But that would become infamous for another reason. A bloody glove was found near the bodies of the two victims. At first, police thought it belonged to one of the victims. Once they compared it to O.J.'s house, they realized it matched a glove that was part of a pair that O.J. owned. Although O.J. claimed he lost the other glove months ago, police suspected foul play and arrested him for the murders. The public was shocked. People knew O.J. Simpson. He was a celebrity. In fact, he was probably the biggest sports celebrity in America at the time. He was like Michael Jordan or Tom Brady if they also hosted their own TV shows. And that's exactly what O.J. did. His self-titled show, The O.J. Simpson Show, was extremely popular in the 80s and early 90s. But perhaps more importantly than that, O.J. was black, and Nicole, his ex-wife, was white. So this case quickly became about much more than just murder. It became about race relations in America. On top of all of that, O.J. had already been accused of domestic violence in the past. There was a history of him being abusive towards Nicole. As such, many people believed that he was guilty long before the trial even started. But the prosecution's case was not as strong as they thought. During the preliminary hearings, a detective admitted to planting some of the evidence that tied O.J. to the crime scene, including the bloody glove. Now, that wasn't necessarily the end of the case, because as the judge saw it, the glove was merely corroborating evidence. The main evidence was the DNA evidence. According to the New York Times, prosecution said Mr. Simpson's blood type was an exact match with the blood found at the scene, and his DNA was present on blood samples taken from both victims. And then there was the blood on his sock. Just hours after the killings, Mr. Simpson's Rockingham estate was searched by the police, and a blood-stained sock was found on the lawn. Experts said the blood on the sock was almost certainly Miss Brown's. At the same time, however, the defense brought up the possibility that the sock could have been planted on the lawn. Ultimately, the judge decided that there was enough evidence for the case to go to trial. Once the trial began, the prosecutors made the shocking claim that O.J. had committed a double homicide in cold blood. However, O.J.'s defense team, led by Johnnie Cochran, argued that the real killer was an unknown intruder who had attacked the couple inside their home and then fled. That's right. O.J. didn't kill Nicole and her friend, according to the defense. He walked in on them being killed by someone else, and then that other guy ran away. But everyone assumed that O.J. was going to be found guilty. What we mean by everyone is literally everyone, including the judge and even O.J. himself. He reportedly told his producer at Fox, quote, "I just want you to know I'm innocent before I go to jail." But of course, that's not what happened. You see, despite the seemingly overwhelming evidence against O.J., John Cochran and his co-counsel turned things around and cast doubt on every single piece of evidence presented by the prosecution, including the DNA evidence, which at the time was fairly new and had never before been used in a criminal trial. They successfully painted everyone involved in collecting the evidence as racists who wanted to see O.J. behind bars. Cochran even suggested that the police framed O.J. because they needed a good publicity stunt, given that African Americans made up only 1% of the police force in L.A. at the time. And somehow, despite all the evidence against him, the jury bought it. In this photo, you can see how attentive the jury was throughout the trial. After deliberating for 4 months, the jury came back with a verdict. O.J. was acquitted of both charges, meaning that he was not guilty of either murder. How is that possible? Well, if you ask us here at Legal Eagle, we'll tell you that it all came down to the closing argument. Johnny Cochran didn't bring anything new to the table during his closing argument. He didn't introduce any new evidence or witnesses. Rather, he just used everything that the prosecution had presented and spun it in a way that made O.J. look innocent. In fact, the opening statement and the closing statement are exactly the same. Johnny simply took all of the facts that the jury had heard over the last few months and wove them together into a narrative that supported his client's innocence. And that's what great lawyers do. Doesn't matter how much evidence you have. If you can't present it in a way that makes sense, you're screwed. And that's exactly what Johnny did. At the beginning of his closing argument, Johnny thanked the jury for their service and reminded them that they had the responsibility of determining whether his client was guilty or not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Johnny acknowledged that the evidence was strong but argued that it was not conclusive. He reminded the jury that the prosecution had not proved that O.J. had actually committed the murders and that there was still reasonable doubt. Johnny asked the jury to consider the DNA evidence, which was the prosecution's main piece of evidence. He argued that the DNA experts were not qualified to give their opinion and that the results were not reliable. He pointed out that the blood typing technology was relatively new and had not yet been accepted by the scientific community. Johnny also attacked the credibility of the police officers who had collected the evidence. He alleged that they had planted some of the evidence and that they had not followed proper procedures when collecting the DNA samples. He reminded the jury that one of the officers had already admitted to planting the glove. Johnny argued that if the police had planted one piece of evidence, then they could have planted the other pieces too. Then, of course, there was the infamous line, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." Johnny Cochran asked the jury to try on one of the gloves that was found at O.J.'s house. He suggested that the glove was too big for Nicole and that the police had planted it on O.J.'s lawn to frame him. Of course, this was absurd. The glove did fit Nicole, but that didn't matter. Johnny had already planted the seed of doubt in the minds of the jury. And finally, Johnny addressed the issue of race. He argued that the police and the prosecutors were motivated by racism, and that they had targeted O.J. because he was a black celebrity. Johnny suggested that the police needed a big case to solve, because they had not solved many high-profile crimes in the black community. He argued that the prosecutors were trying to make a name for themselves by getting a conviction in a high-profile case. In the end, it was Johnny Cochran's closing argument that convinced the jury that O.J. was innocent. The jury believed that there was reasonable doubt that O.J. had committed the murders and therefore acquitted him. Johnny Cochran was hailed as a legal legend. The closing argument is often ranked as one of the best in history and is taught in law schools today. Johnny Cochran went on to become one of the most famous trial lawyers in the world, and O.J. Simpson went on to become a celebrity chef. Just kidding. Went on to spend 7 years in prison for an unrelated crime. But you can bet that if Johnny Cochran had represented him in that case, things could have ended very differently. Anyway, guys, that's how one of the most famous closing arguments in legal history changed the course of the O.J. Simpson trial. We hope you learned something new. If you did, please leave us a like and a comment down below. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our future videos.